Tonight on Closer Look, an ex-firefighter has been sentenced to life without parole for at least 20 years for killing his wife. Buried Today court reporter Peter Robinson joins us tonight with more on the sentencing of James Schwalm. Peter, you were in the courtroom when Schwalm was sentenced on Monday, but before we get to that, let's take a few steps back to recount how we got here. We know that James and Ashley Schwalm's marriage was crumbling, and as the judge pointed out, James Schwalm could not handle the disruption to his life that a separation and eventual divorce would entail. So he took matters into his own hands. Peter, maybe pick up the story from there, how Schwalm devised a scheme to murder his wife, but staged it to look like an accident.
Yeah, so you've said it right, Scott, and thanks for having me. Basically in January of 2023, I guess, he hatched a scheme in order to, it was clear that their marriage was coming to an end. There had been some infidelity. They had tried to work through it. It looked like it looks like a reconciliation was not possible. So he hatched a scheme not long after Christmas, by the sounds of it, in 2023 into January, whereby he would set up, he would kill her in the home, which he did by strangling her, and then stage the scene to make it look like she was in a car crash while taking an early morning hike just outside of town near Craigleith, the ski club, which is just outside of Collingwood. Anybody who's familiar with the area would know it's kind of a winter all-season playground, really. And so really he hatched a scheme. It started with he literally checked with a doctor to check in on methods for breaking someone's neck. That was introduced into evidence. Most cruelly of all, probably, is he had his wife buy gasoline in order to set her car on fire the day before she ended up being murdered. And then when she did that, and then when he returned home that night from his shift in Brampton at the firehouse there, he took his children with him to drop his daughter off at a riding lesson, and he cased the scene where he was going to make his getaway. And as it turned out, the murder happened later that night, and he set his plan in motion. And of course, as you can imagine, that sort of scheme had many chances to fail, and it did, and it wasn't long before the police were on his trail.
Okay, so let's get to that point, Peter. How was he eventually caught?
Well, it basically, he hatched a scheme where the car was driven off the road not far from Alpine Ski Club, which is right next door to Craigleith, which is, as it turned out, where they were married a decade earlier. But an Alpine employee arrived on the scene within minutes of the car being on fire. Ashley's body, they didn't know it was her body at the time, but it was found on the passenger side. So obviously people who are driving cars can't be driving them from the passenger side. So that was an instance, a red flag, as were footprints from the driver's side that the man who discovered the fire alerted the first responders. And so basically from there, he left the scene, and it was later captured on CCTV in various contexts of making his way to to Alpine in order to get a car, his mother's car that he had put there the night before. And then he drove back to the house where he had previously left his children unattended and got them ready for school for the day. Dropped them off at school, left the car there so his mother could go pick it up, and then went to work at his part-time job. And it was there that people found him to inform that his wife had passed away. Or I guess they didn't officially know at that point that it was her body that was burnt in the passenger side. But it was pretty obvious no one could get a hold of her. She was unaccounted for. And then later, around the same time, they actually found his lighter with his initials on it that was inside the car.
Peter, there was a very chilling line that the judge uttered that really stood out to me, and I'm quoting here. He sent the children to school knowing what the kids did not, that they would never see their mother again. It really exemplifies the cold, callous, heartless nature of what happened here.
Yeah, and the judge actually turned to him, whereas she read out most of the facts in her sentencing to the body of the court. She actually turned to him when she said that. And it was a well-crafted, succinct description of what really happened. The idea of a father taking his children to school knowing that he had just killed their mother is almost beyond words to describe.
It certainly is. Okay, let's get back to the courtroom on Monday. Can you paint a picture for us? Who was there? What was the mood like?
Yeah, I mean, God rest her soul. Ashley Milnes was obviously a widely loved person in her community among her friend group, both in Toronto where she grew up, but also where she moved to be with James in Collingwood. The courtroom was packed like it was with the sentencing hearing back before Christmas. I would say there was about 40 people. All of them were her friends and family. I thought it was interesting that her father, who spoke last at the pre-sentence hearing, gave the last victim impact statement. His name is Ian Milnes. He was not there yesterday. I'm not sure why, but I would imagine he probably couldn't stand to be in the same room as the man that killed his daughter.
So ultimately, Peter, what was the sentence handed down by Superior Court Justice Michelle First?
Well, at the sentencing hearing that I'm referring to before Christmas, the range was 13 to 21 years. Those of us who sort of had an interest in following it from professional reasons, we figured that she would come in at about 17, 18 years, maybe not split the distance, but a little towards the high end. She didn't. She set it at 20 years, which was virtually at the top level. He got a small amount of credit for the fact that he did not have a criminal record before this. And she used the term pro-social life, which is kind of a legal term to describe yourself as being a otherwise law-abiding citizen, obviously up to the point he killed his wife. So that shaved a year or two off the upper limit, but he essentially gets 2 years credit plus a little bit of pre-sentence credit for the harsh conditions at Central North, which is a pretty brutal place to spend time in custody. So really, he's eligible to apply for parole in 18 years from about right now, probably a little less, but very few offenders. Murder offenders, people who murder especially their spouse, are granted parole on the first go. So the idea of him getting out 18 years from now is probably pretty remote. He's, at the end of the day, he is serving a life sentence, and the earliest he can apply for parole is in 18 years.
So the sentence is read. Peter, can you describe the reaction in the courtroom?
There was literally, I won't call it a gasp, but there was almost like you could feel the atmosphere recognize the fact that she, some would argue that the Canadian justice system is too lenient, and I tend to agree with some of the cases I see. But in the context of second-degree murder in Canada, she basically threw the book at him. He was a first offender, and he got almost the maximum amount of time before he can apply for parole eligibility. So there was a clear... there's no happy endings in a terrible case like this, but you could tell that there was some satisfaction amongst her family and friends that the judge went high.
Buried Today court reporter Peter Robinson on tonight's Closer Look.